There's a moment in every great tale when a kingdom stands at the edge of glory, when its towers gleam in the sunlight, its people thrive in abundance, and its rulers seem untouchable. But beneath that golden surface, something darker stirs. Tonight, we step into one of the most haunting chapters of Tolkien's legendarium, the tragic downfall of Númenor, the island kingdom that dared to challenge the gods themselves. Picture an island bathed in eternal sunlight, its harbors filled with ships, its halls echoing with the wisdom of ages. This is Númenor at its peak, a paradise built by the hands of men blessed by the Valar. But paradise, as we'll soon see, is fragile, and the seeds of its destruction lie in the heart of its proudest king. Where are you joining us from tonight? Whether you're listening under the glow of a midnight lamp or the first light of dawn, we'd love to know. Drop a comment below and tell us where your journey into this story begins. Because this isn't just a tale of ancient ruins and forgotten kings. It's a story about ambition, about the intoxicating lure of immortality, and the price of defying the divine. And at its center stands Ar-Pharazôn, the last and mightiest king of Númenor, a man whose name would echo through history as both a conqueror and a caution. The whispers reached him first as murmurs on the wind, stories of a land beyond the western sea, where the immortal Valar dwelt in unchanging bliss. To a king who had already mastered the known world, the thought of such a place was unbearable. Why should the gods alone possess eternity? Why should mortal men, even the greatest among them, fade into dust? These questions festered in his mind, fed by the flattery of his court and the growing shadow of a dark advisor, Sauron, the deceiver, who saw in Númenor's pride the perfect tool for his revenge. The stage was set, the ships were built, and as the king's fleet set sail toward the forbidden shores of Valinor, the very air seemed to hold its breath. What followed would be a cataclysm so vast, it would reshape the world itself. The grand fleet rose from the harbors of Númenor like a forest of masts against the sky, each ship a testament to human ambition. Ar-Pharazôn walked the docks with a conqueror's stride, his eyes fixed not on the waves before him, but on the horizon beyond, where the undying lands shimmered like a taunt. To him, the ban of the Valar was not a warning, but a challenge. If elves could dwell in those blessed shores untouched by time, why not men? Why not the mightiest king the world had ever known? His people, drunk on the glory of their empire, echoed his defiance. They carved prows into the likeness of eagles and serpents, as if their vessels could intimidate the very gods. Yet not all voices joined the chorus. In the marble halls of the faithful, whispers of dissent lingered. These were the few who still revered the old ways, who remembered that Númenor's greatness came not from conquest, but from wisdom. They saw the shadow creeping into their king's heart, the way his laughter grew colder, his decrees harsher. And then there was Sauron, the so-called advisor, whose golden tongue dripped poison into every royal ear. He spoke of power as if it were a right, of immortality as if it were a prize to be seized. With each passing day, the divide deepened. Families turned against one another. Temples to the Valar were torn down, replaced with altars to darkness. The day the fleet set sail, the sea itself seemed to recoil. Waves that had once cradled Númenor's ships now churned uneasily, as if sensing the blasphemy of their course. The king stood at the helm, clad in armor that gleamed like stolen starlight, his banner snapping defiantly in the wind. Behind him, the Island Kingdom shrank into the distance, its towers still golden, its fields still fertile, but its soul already slipping toward ruin. The faithful watched from the cliffs, their prayers drowned out by the cheers of the loyal. None could have imagined how swiftly the sky would darken, how the waves would rise like walls to meet them. For in that moment, pride blinded them all. Amid the clamor of hammers and the creaking of ships, one voice rose above the noise, not in defiance, but in desperate warning. Elendil, Lord of the Faithful, stood before the king's throne, his cloak worn thin by years of service, his face etched with the weight of prophecy. "Turn back," he urged, his words cutting through the court's feverish excitement like a cold wind. The Valar do not share their gifts by threat or conquest. To sail west is to break the very covenant that raised Númenor from the sea. The silence that followed was brittle, broken only by the rustle of silk as the courtiers exchanged glances. Ar-Pharazôn leaned forward, his crown catching the light like a blade. "You speak treason, old friend," he said softly, though the room heard every syllable. "Or is it cowardice?" The insult hung in the air, but Elendil did not flinch. He had known this king as a boy, had watched pride harden his heart like molten gold poured into a mold. Behind the throne, Sauron's golden eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. The Lord of the Faithful had become an inconvenience. Whispers spread traitor, doom monger, a relic of a bygone age. Yet as the guards escorted him from the hall, Elendil's thoughts were not of his own disgrace, but of his son, Elendil, waiting beyond the city gates, and the fragile hope he carried. That night, beneath a sky strewn with stars that seemed to watch in sorrow, he gathered his family in the quiet of their ancestral home. The maps they unrolled were not of conquest, but of escape. "The king's path leads only to ruin," he told them, his hand resting on his grandson's shoulder. "But ours need not." In the weeks that followed, while Númenor's banners snapped proudly in the wind, the faithful worked in shadows. Ships meant for fishing were secretly fortified, their hulls strengthened for a voyage no one dared name aloud. Provisions were stockpiled, not for war, but for survival. And always, Elendil watched the western horizon, where the sun dipped each evening, as if retreating from what was to come. He knew the cost of defiance. The Valar's justice was not gentle, yet as he knelt in the empty temple, where his people had once sung praises to the stars, he made his choice. One last plea would be carried to the undying lands, not by force, but by humility. The fate of Númenor was sealed, but perhaps, just perhaps, the seed of its wisdom might endure. Sauron's surrender was a masterstroke of deception, a performance so convincing even the wisest among the Númenorians failed to recognize the serpent in their midst. When his dark forces faltered against their might, he did not flee or resist, he knelt. Chains that could not hold him were draped over his shoulders like ornaments, and he entered the court of Ar-Pharazôn, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. His voice, smooth as polished obsidian, carried no trace of defiance. Instead, he offered flattery woven with half-truths, praising the king's unmatched power while subtly fanning the embers of his discontent. "Why should the mightiest of men bow to distant gods?" he murmured, his golden eyes glinting with feigned reverence. "Your people have built wonders that rival Valinor itself. Should not the ruler of such a realm decide his own destiny. Slowly, the poison took root. Sauron's whispers became edicts, his suggestions doctrines. The old altars to the Valar, once adorned with flowers and song, were left to crumble as new temples clawed at the sky, black spires where no light seemed to linger. There, in the flicker of unnatural flames, the Númenorians bowed not to the lords of the West, but to Morgoth, the forgotten enemy. Sauron's artistry was in his patience. He did not demand their allegiance, he made them crave it. He spoke of immortality as if it were a treasure withheld out of spite, and the king's heart, already swollen with pride, hardened into obsession. "The Valar fear you," Sauron murmured, his voice a shadow at the king's ear. "Why else would they forbid you from their shores? They know your strength could eclipse theirs." The people, once noble and wise, now clutched at darkness like a lifeline. Fathers taught their children to spit at the names of the Valar. Mothers hung amulets of twisted metal around their necks, symbols of a faith built on fear. Even the stars, those ancient witnesses to Númenor's glory, seemed to dim overhead, as if turning away from what their favored children had become. Yet in the quiet corners of the island, where the faithful still dared to gather, the truth lingered like a dying ember. They remembered the days when wisdom, not power, was their people's crown, but their voices were drowned beneath the roar of the forge, the chant of the priests, the drumbeat of a kingdom marching toward its own ruin. Sauron, standing at the king's right hand, allowed himself a smile, thin and sharp as a blade. The fall of Numenor would not come by his hand, but by theirs. And that was the sweetest victory of all. The night air was thick with salt and secrecy, as Elendil moved among the shadows of the harbor, his cloak pulled tight against the wind that seemed to whisper warnings. Around him, the faithful worked in silence, their faces grim beneath hoods drawn low, chests filled with scrolls, centuries of lore, maps of forgotten stars, songs of the Valar that had once echoed through Númenor's golden halls, were carried aboard waiting ships. Each relic was a thread torn from the tapestry of their homeland, a fragment of light they refused to let drown in the coming storm. The weight of what they carried was more than physical. It was the last breath of a dying world, cradled in trembling hands. Torches flickered in the distance, the king's spies, prowling the docks like hungry gulls. Elendil's grip tightened on his father's staff, its wood worn smooth by generations of guiding hands. Elendil was gone now, vanished into the west on a fool's errand or a sacred mission, no one could say. All that remained was his final command: save what you can. The order had been simple. The cost was written in the tear-streaked faces of the women, bundling children into the ships, in the way men paused to press their foreheads to the soil one last time. This was not just flight, it was a severing. The sails unfurled like ghosts in the moonlight, catching a wind that smelled of rain and reckoning. As the ropes were cut and the hulls groaned free of the dock, Elendil stood at the stern, his eyes fixed on the receding silhouette of Armenilos. The city's towers still glittered, oblivious to the doom coiling beneath its streets. Somewhere in those palaces, Sauron's laughter slithered through the halls, and the king dreamed of godhood, while the sea stirred uneasily beneath him. The faithful did not weep. They had no tears left. Instead, they sang softly, as if the ocean itself might betray them, the old hymns of Elendil, the mariner who had once bridged earth and heaven. Dawn found them far from shore, the first light staining the waves crimson, as if the sea bled for what was to come. Behind them, a distant rumble shook the horizon. Not thunder, not wind. The children clutched their mothers' robes, and the sailors crossed their arms over their chests, a gesture half of prayer, half of ward. Elendil did not turn to look. He already knew what they would see. The sky splitting, the waters rearing like enraged beasts. The island he had loved, swallowed by the wrath of the very gods his people had scorned. The wind that filled their sails now was no longer their ally, but a fugitive, fleeing with them toward the ragged edges of the world. Middle-earth lay ahead, a land of shadows and stranger kings. They would rebuild, they would remember, but first, they would mourn for Numenor, for the fallen, for the weight of carrying a lost world's light into the gathering dark. The black sails of Ar-Pharazôn's armada blotted out the western horizon like a storm made manifest, their vast shadows creeping across the waves as if the sea itself recoiled from their blasphemous voyage. No longer content with ruling men, the king had drunk deep from Sauron's poison, the lie that immortality could be seized like a crown, that the undying lands would bow before the might of Numenor's steel. His decree had echoed through the streets of Armanelos, a thunderclap of madness. Why should we plead for what is ours by right? The people, once wise stewards of the sea, now stood silent on the cliffs, their faces upturned as the fleet slid toward destiny. Some wept, some cheered. None dared speak the truth aloud. Their king had condemned them all. Sauron's hand was invisible in this folly, yet it gripped every timber of those ships. He had stoked the king's pride like a forge fire, whispering that the Valar's ban was not law but fear, fear of men who might rise to equal them. The temples of Morgoth, their altars slick with offerings, stood as grotesque mockeries of Numenor's former glory. And in the dead of night, when the torches guttered low, the Dark Lord smiled to hear the chants of sacrifice, the desperate pleas of a people bargaining with shadows for a life they could no longer earn. The morning of departure dawned blood-red, a stain across the sky that even the most fervent loyalists could not ignore. Ar-Pharazôn stood at the prow of his flagship, his armor gleaming like a false star, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could already see the shores of Valinor crumbling before him. The sea, once Numenor's ally, lay unnaturally still, as though holding its breath. Birds fled inland, the wind died to a whisper. Only the creak of ropes and the distant sobs of children broke the stillness. In the palace, abandoned by its king, Sauron climbed the highest tower, not to watch the fleet's progress, but to savor the moment. His form, fair and terrible, seemed to drink the sunlight, casting no shadow on the marble beneath him. The game was nearly over. The Valar would not suffer such defiance, and he knew the price of Ar-Pharazôn's ambition better than any. Yet this was no mere reckoning, it was artistry. The fall of Numenor would be no simple drowning. It would be an unraveling of trust, of history, of the very bonds between earth and heaven. And when the waves closed over the island's spires, the world would forget that men had ever been the favored children of the gods. Back on the ships, the soldiers clutched their weapons with sweating palms, their earlier bravado crumbling like sand beneath their boots. The farther they sailed, the heavier the air became, thick with a scent like ozone and old stone. The sea, once clear as glass, darkened to the hue of bruises. Somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the world, the first ripple of divine wrath stirred, not as a tempest, but as a sigh, the kind a parent might utter before lifting a hand to correct a wayward child. The king, blind to omens, raised his sword in triumph. His men, less foolish, began to pray. The first sign was not the wave, but the silence, a hush so profound it seemed the very air had fled in terror. The golden sails of Numenor's fleet hung limp, their gilded threads glinting uselessly in the fading light. Then the sky cracked open, not with thunder, but with a sound like the world itself inhaling sharply. The waters, once calm as glass, began to shudder, not in waves but in great, heaving tremors, as if the sea were recoiling from what marched upon it. Ar-Pharazôn's flagship lurched violently, its proud prow dipping as if bowing to some unseen force. On the horizon, where the undying lands should have shimmered like a dream, the clouds coiled into shapes no mortal eye had ever witnessed. Towers of storm, spiraling upward like the fingers of a closing fist. The Valar did not appear in wrathful majesty. There were no blazing chariots, no hosts of armored angels. Their judgment came as something far more terrible, inevitability. The sea did not rise. It simply changed, its surface lifting like the flank of some vast beast rousing from slumber. The wave, when it came, was not water but motion itself, a wall of darkness that blotted out the sky. Ships splintered like kindling, their masts snapping like twigs, their crews swept away without even time to scream. Ar-Pharazôn, his crown still gleaming with stolen light, gripped the rail as the deck tilted beneath him. For the first time in his life, the king of Numenor knew fear, not the sharp sting of battle, but the slow, dawning horror of a child realizing it has angered a parent beyond words. Beneath the island, the earth groaned. Fissures split the cobbled streets of Armenilos, swallowing temples and palaces alike. The great silver dome of the royal court, where Sauron had whispered his poison, collapsed inward like a deflated lung. In the blackened pits where altars to Morgoth had stood, flames guttered and died, as if even darkness refused sanctuary. The people ran, not toward the docks or the hills, but in circles, their cries rising into a cacophony of disbelief. This was not invasion, not war. This was the universe itself folding Numenor out of existence. And Sauron, the deceiver, the architect of this ruin, stood atop the highest remaining tower, his fair form flickering like a candle in the wind. As the first stones tumbled into the abyss, his laughter rang out not in triumph, but in relief. His body, a mere vessel, would perish with the island. But his spirit, a shadow unbound by flesh, would twist free of the depths. The Valar's wrath was absolute, their justice unyielding, yet in their mercy, for even judgment can be merciful, they allowed no survivors to carry the shame of Numenor's fall into the ages to come. Only the faithful, already far at sea, would bear witness, and even they, as the great wave surged eastward, dared not look back. The last thing they heard was not the crash of collapsing mountains or the hiss of drowning fire, but a single resonant note, like a bell tolling in the deep, the sound of the world shifting forever. The ocean did not simply swallow Numenor, it erased it. One moment, the island stood as a jewel of civilization, its white towers piercing the clouds, its vineyards heavy with fruit, its libraries whispering with the wisdom of ages. The next, the sea yawned wide like the maw of some primordial beast, and the earth itself seemed to crumble inward. The great city of Armenilos, where kings had walked for centuries in golden splendor, slid beneath the waves in a single, shuddering gasp. Ar-Pharazôn's final cry was not of defiance, but of disbelief, his crown still gleaming as the water closed over him, his outstretched fingers grasping at nothing but swirling darkness. The armada that had dared to challenge the gods vanished like foam on the tide, their black sails dissolving into the churn. Far to the east, the faithful felt the shockwave before they saw it, a tremor in the air that made the very planks of their ships groan. Then came the light, a searing flash that turned the horizon white, as if the sun had plunged into the sea. Elendil shielded his eyes, but the brilliance burned through his eyelids, etching after images of towering spires and collapsing cliffs onto his vision. When the light faded, a stillness followed, deeper than any silence they had ever known. No birds called, no wind stirred. Even the waves seemed to hold their breath, as if the world itself were mourning. Then the sound reached them, not a roar, but a moan, a vast and wordless lament that seemed to rise from the depths. The children clutched at their mothers' skirts, and the sailors fell to their knees, their faces streaked with salt and tears. The faithful did not cheer their deliverance. They did not curse the drowned. They simply stood, hollow-eyed, watching the place where their homeland had been, where now only a sickly green glow pulsed beneath the water like a fading heartbeat. Some whispered prayers, others sang fragments of old hymns, their voices breaking on the words. Elendil turned his back to the west at last, his hands gripping the ship's rail until his knuckles whitened. Behind him, the last embers of Numenor's light guttered out beneath the waves. Ahead lay only open sea and the gathering dark. But in the holds of those ships, tucked between sacks of grain and casks of water, lay the true legacy of their people. Scrolls of lore, seeds from the orchards of Eldilanda, a sapling of the white tree that had once bloomed in the king's court. These were not treasures, they were promises. The faithful would carry them to Middle-earth, where new kingdoms would rise from the wreckage of the old. But first, they would sail through the long night, bearing the weight of a loss too vast for words. The sea had taken their home, it would not take their hope. The waves, now calm and indifferent, carried them eastward. Behind them, the stars emerged one by one, cold and distant witnesses to the birth of a new age. No tombstone would mark Numenor's grave. No epitaph would honor its pride or folly. Only the wind would remember, whispering across the empty water where an island had once been. A whisper that would linger in the blood of its scattered children, a warning and a wound for all the ages of the world. The hulls of Elendil's ships scraped against the unfamiliar shores of Middle-earth with a sound like a weary sigh, their timbers groaning from the strain of the cataclysm they had escaped. The survivors stumbled onto the sand, their legs unsteady after weeks of clinging to hope amid the endless gray of the sea. Some fell to their knees, pressing their palms into the damp earth, as if to assure themselves this land was real, not another cruel mirage. Behind them, the waves rolled in, indifferent, carrying no trace of the home they had lost. The sky here was different, lower, heavier, its colors muted compared to Numenor's luminous dawns. Yet as Elendil raised his eyes to the jagged line of mountains in the distance, he felt something stir in his chest, fragile but insistent. Not hope, not yet. But the possibility of it. They had salvaged more than their lives from the wreckage. Crates of parchment, their edges curled with salt water, held the laws and songs of a civilization that no longer existed. Seedlings wrapped in damp cloth bore the lineage of Numenor's orchards, their roots still clinging to the soil of a vanished island. And then there was the sapling slender, its leaves trembling in the wind, the last scion of Nimloth, the white tree that had stood in Armanilos's court, its blossoms said to wither when shadow touched the land. Elendil's fingers brushed its bark, a silent vow passing between them like a spark. They would not merely survive, they would remember, the group fractured like shards of a broken mirror, each fragment reflecting a different path. Some turned north, where whispers spoke of ancient forests and high valleys sheltered from the storms of the world. These would become the Dunedain of Arnor, their fortresses rising like sentinels against the creeping dark. Others marched south, following the curve of the coast to where the mountains cradled a fertile plain. There, Gondor would rise, its white towers a pale echo of Numenor's glory, its throne room built to face the west, an unspoken homage to the land beneath the waves. But before the parting, they gathered one last time on that lonely shore, lighting a fire not for warmth, but for witness. Into the flames they cast tokens of their old lives, a shard of pottery from Armanilos's markets, a tattered banner embroidered with the star of Elendil's house, a handful of salt scraped from their own tears. The smoke curled upward, carrying their grief to the indifferent stars. No speeches were made, no oath shouted, only silence, thick and sacred, as the embers faded into ash. Years later, when Gondor's first king would walk the ramparts of Minas Anor, or when a ranger in Arnor would pause to trace the 7 stars on his cloak, they would feel it not just the weight of memory, but the quiet urgency in their blood. Numenor was gone, but its children, scattered like seeds on the wind, would root themselves in this new earth, and though their kingdoms would rise and fall in turn, the light they carried flickering, defiant, would outlast even the shadow of Sauron's vengeance. For now, though, there was only the rasp of sand underfoot, the cry of gulls overhead, and the slow, steady work of building a world from fragments. The waves had barely stilled over Numenor's grave when the darkness began to stir. Sauron's body, that fair and terrible form he had worn to deceive kings, was swallowed by the sea, but the sea could not hold him. His spirit, a wisp of smoke and shadow, twisted free of the drowning ruins, slithering through the abyss like a serpent escaping fire. The Valar's wrath had shattered the island, but malice is harder to drown than stone. Eastward he fled, across the heaving deep, drawn to the land where his power still festered in the earth like an old wound. Mordor waited, its plains barren, its mountains jagged as broken teeth, a kingdom built for shadow. The survivors, huddled on Middle-earth shores, felt the chill of his passing like a winter gust. Elendil, scanning the horizon where the last of Numenor's light had vanished, gripped his sword's hilt, though no enemy stood before him. Some terrors leave no footprints, yet the air itself trembles in their wake. His people whispered of dreams, black sails on a windless sea, a laugh that slithered through the cracks of their makeshift shelters. They had escaped the drowning, but not the dread. For Sauron's greatest trick was this: he made men fear not just his strength, but their own weakness. The shadow he cast was not of armies, but of doubt. Mordor welcomed its master with a shudder. The ash-choked plains stirred as his spirit settled into the familiar scorch of Orodruin's fires. The mountain's molten heart quickened, its flames licking higher, as if in recognition. Here, in this lifeless waste, Sauron's will coiled like a spring. Rings had been forged in these fires once precious, poisoned things. The elves still wore theirs, unaware of the snare tightening. The dwarves' lust for gold had blinded them to the rot in their hoards, and men were ever the easiest prey. The fall of Númenor had proven that. Yet the Dark Lord's triumph was not without bitterness. His armor of lies had cracked in the drowning. The One Ring, the anchor of his power, lay unfinished in the ruins of his forge. Without it, his spirit could not take fresh form, could not wield the crushing might he had planned. For now, he would rule through whispers, through the fear that gnawed at Gondor's fledgling walls, through the greed of petty kings who traded their people's safety for promises of dominion. The faithful had carried Númenor's light to Middle-earth, but Sauron had smuggled its darkest lesson ashore, that even the mightiest of men could be broken by their own pride. High in the Juath, where the cliffs hid the sky, a faint glow pulsed in the depths of Barad-dûr. The tower, though shattered in the war that had exiled him centuries before, remembered its shape. Stone groaned as unseen hands willed it upward, brick by blackened brick. Sauron's laughter, when it came, was soundless of vibration in the earth that sent wolves fleeing from their dens. His war with the Valar was lost. His war with men had only just begun. The chest opened with a groan, its hinges stiff from years of salt and secrecy. Inside, nestled in folds of faded velvet, lay 7 spheres, smooth as river stones, dark as midnight, yet humming with a light that seemed to pulse from within. Elendil's calloused hands hovered above them, not quite touching, as if the Palantiri might dissolve like mist if grasped too tightly. These were no mere heirlooms. They were the last breath of Númenor's wisdom, forged in an age when men still spoke with the Valar as friends. His sons leaned in, their breath catching in unison. Isildur's fingers twitched toward the largest stone, its surface swirling with shadows that moved like living ink. "They see," he murmured, not as a question, but as a dread-struck realization. Even now they see, and Arion, ever the pragmatist, reached instead for his sword, his thumb testing the edge honed on the whetstone of exile. The blade bore no ornament, no filigree, only the stark utility of a tool meant to endure. "Stones won't shield us from what comes," he said, though his eyes lingered on the Palantir's depths. "Sauron won't be swayed by visions." Elendil's smile was thin, etched with the weariness of a man who has carried too many burdens. "Visions, no, but these are more than scrying glasses, my son. They're bridges." He lifted the smallest stone, cradling it in his palm like a wounded bird. "Your grandfather once told me the Palantiri were gifts from the elves of Tal Erasure, crafted to span the gulfs between hearts and minds. In Númenor's twilight, they became tools of spies and kings. But their true purpose," the stone flared suddenly, its core igniting with a blue-white radiance that cast their faces in sharp relief, "was to remind us that no land, no kingdom, is truly isolated. Not while memory survives." Isildur's jaw tightened. Memory was a double-edged sword. He had seen the madness in Ar-Pharazôn's eyes when the king scoffed at the past, had heard the way Sauron's honeyed words turned history into a weapon. And if the enemy steals one, twists it as he twisted everything else, the light in Elendil's hand dimmed but did not die, "then we fight," he said simply. "Not just with steel, but with the truth these stones preserve. Sauron fears nothing so much as the unbroken line of wisdom, the proof that men need not be puppets." He pressed the Palantir into Isildur's hands, closing his son's fingers around it. The stone was warm, its weight disproportionate to its size, as though it held the gravity of centuries. Guard it well, for when the night grows thick, even a single point of light can guide a kingdom home. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth, Middle Earth's breath, indifferent to the relics in their grasp. Anarion slid his sword back into its sheath with a decisive click. The lesson was clear. The past could illuminate, but it would not wield itself. The stones were not answers. They were questions posed across the ages, and the sons of Númenor, though exiles, would not answer them with bowed heads. Isildur tucked the palantir into the folds of his cloak, its presence a lodestone against his ribs. Somewhere to the east, beyond the jagged teeth of the Ephel-Juath, the first fires of Mordor were stirring. The stones would not avert the storm, but they would ensure that when the tempest broke, the survivors would remember not just the fall, but the light that came before. The drums began as a rumor, a whisper in the markets of Pelargir, a tremor in the roots of the White Mountains. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Another skirmish in the east, another band of orcs preying on the weak. But the rhythm grew louder, a slow, insistent cadence that seeped into the earth itself. Farmers along the Anduin abandoned their fields, their hands trembling as they described columns of smoke rising from the Ephel-Juath. Scouts sent to investigate never returned, and then came the refugees hollow-eyed, their clothes stained with ash, speaking of a darkness that moved like a living thing. Elendil stood on the battlements of Osgiliath, his cloak snapping in the wind as he stared eastward. The palantir in his chamber had shown him fragments, black banners snapping over the ruins of Dagorlad, the glint of armor where no armor should be. But it was the silence of the elves that confirmed his fears. When the messengers from Lindon arrived, their faces grim beneath silver helms, they carried no declarations of war, only a single parchment bearing Gil-galad's seal. The High King's words were spare, etched in ink that seemed too dark, too final. He has returned. The shadow takes shape. The call went out not with fanfare, but with quiet urgency. Riders galloped along the greenway, their torches cutting through the night as they carried the summons to every corner of Gondor and Arnor. In Imladris, Elrond gathered the heirlooms of his house, his voice low as he reminded his kin of the oath their ancestors had sworn. In the dwarven halls of Khazad-dûm, the forges blazed day and night, their hammers ringing with a tempo that mirrored the distant drums. Even the wild men of the hills, who had long warred with Númenor's descendants, sent envoys to Elendil's camp, their rough hands clasping his in wordless understanding. The alliance was fragile, stitched together with old grudges and older hopes. Elves who had watched Númenor fall now marched beside men who bore its scars. Dwarves who distrusted the stars themselves stood shoulder to shoulder with rangers who navigated by them, and at the center stood Elendil, taller than any other man, his sword reforged from the shards of his father's blade. He spoke little of prophecy, of the doom that clung to his bloodline. Instead, he walked among the camps at dusk, stopping to mend a loosened strap here, to share a flask of Maruver, their small axe that bound them tighter than any oath. The night before the host marched, a strange stillness settled over the land. The usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds had vanished, leaving only the rustle of banners in the wind. Isildur found his father kneeling beside a fire, sharpening his dagger with methodical strokes. "Do you think they fear us?" he asked, nodding toward the distant glow of Mordor's fires. Elendil's hands paused. "No," he said at last, "but he should." The blade caught the firelight, its edge gleaming like a slit in the fabric of the dark. Dawn broke over an army that should not have existed, a tapestry of silver and steel, of beards braided for battle, and helms crowned with elven stars. As the first horn sounded, the ground trembled not from the drums of the enemy, but from the march of 10,000 feet, moving as one. The road ahead wound through the choking fumes of the dead marshes, past the shattered teeth of old fortresses. Somewhere beyond lay the Black Gate and the fate of Middle-earth. The elves sang as they marched, their voices weaving through the ranks like a second banner. The dwarves muttered prayers to their stone gods. The men of Gondor clenched their spears, their eyes fixed on the silhouette of Elendil at the van, and high above, unnoticed by any, a single eagle circled, a witness, a reminder that not all light had fled the world. The last alliance had risen, now came the storm. The smoke over Mordor clung to the sky like a shroud, thick enough to choke the sun and stain the armor of the last alliance with a perpetual gray film. Barad-dûr loomed in the distance, its obsidian spires jutting from the ashen plains like the ribs of some long-dead beast. 7 years of siege had carved trenches into the land, littered with broken swords and the bones of those who'd marched beneath banners now faded by time and blood. Yet the host at the Black Gate did not waver. Every elf who knocked an arrow, every dwarf who tightened his grip on his axe, every man who adjusted the weight of his shield, carried the same memory: Númenor's towers crumbling into the sea, swallowed by the arrogance they dared to challenge. This was not just a war against Sauron, it was a reckoning. Gil-galad's spear gleamed even in the dim light, its tip etched with runes that hummed when orcs drew near. At his side, Elendil stood like a pillar of old, his cloak torn, his beard streaked with ash, but his eyes alight with a fire that had burned since the day he'd watched his homeland die. They spoke little now, these two kings. Words had been spent in the early years of the siege, when hope was still a thing to be kindled. Now, there was only the grind of stone under boot heels, the distant shriek of Nazgul circling the fortress, and the unspoken truth: victory would cost more than any of them had imagined. The dwarves, ever practical, had tunneled beneath the plains, their picks biting into rock where swords could not. Deep in the earth, they whispered of foundations older than Sauron's malice, of veins of ore that pulsed with a heat not born of any forge. Sometimes the walls of their tunnels would tremble, not from the enemy's drums, but from something deeper, as if the mountain itself remembered the elves who had once sung it into being. Above ground, the men of Gondor and Arnor fortified their lines with palisades carved from the blackened trees of the Morgul Vale. They worked in shifts, their hands raw from labor, their dreams haunted by the same vision: a golden island sinking beneath waves, and a shadow laughing as it fled. Then came the morning when the air changed. No horn sounded, no order was given, yet every soldier knew the final assault was upon them. Elendil clasped his son's shoulder, his voice rough as the wind over the Affel-Juath. "Remember the white tree," he said, and Isildur nodded, his fingers brushing the hilt of his sword, not Narsil, not yet, but a blade that had tasted years of war. Ahead, the gates of Barad-dûr groaned, their hinges screaming like wounded animals. From the darkness within, a tide of orcs surged, their eyes reflecting the last embers of the Alliance's campfires. The elves moved first, their arrows cutting black arcs through the smoke. The dwarves bellowed ancient oaths as they swung their mattocks. The men, their shields locked tight, advanced with a cadence that shook the earth. And high above, unnoticed in the chaos, the clouds parted just for a moment, revealing a single, piercing star. It was not a sign, not a promise, but for those who glanced upward, breath ragged, it was enough. The shadow had ruled Mordor for an age. Today, it would learn the weight of light. The ground trembled as Sauron descended from the black gates, his form wreathed in flame and shadow. Each step sent cracks racing through the battlefield, splitting the earth like the fragile crust of a dying world. Elendil met him first, Narsil gleaming in his grip, the sword that had crossed the sea from drowned Númenor, its edge still sharp with the memory of lost glory. Their clash shook the sky, a duel of titans under the eye of the scorched sun. For a moment, it seemed the king might prevail. Then came the Dark Lord's counterstroke, a blow so brutal it shattered Narsil's blade and crushed the life from Elendil's chest. The High King of Gondor fell, his blood seeping into the same earth that had swallowed his homeland. Isildur's scream tore through the chaos. He did not hesitate. Snatching the hilt of his father's broken sword, he lunged before Sauron could revel in his triumph. The jagged remnant of Narsil found its mark, biting deep into the Dark Lord's finger. The ring, that circle of molten gold, tumbled free, and with it, Sauron's power unraveled like a frayed thread. His armor dissolved into screams and smoke, his form scattering on the wind as the armies of Mordor shrieked in dismay. Victory, hard won and drenched in blood, belonged to the last alliance. Yet as Isildur knelt in the ashes, the ring glinting at his feet, the air grew thick with something fouler than smoke. It called to him not in words, but in pulses, like a second heartbeat syncing with his own. Here was power. Here was recompense for all Númenor had lost. The voices of his father's council, the warnings of the elves, even the memory of Amandil's desperate voyage, all faded beneath that golden whisper. Why should it not be yours? The silence seemed to ask, did you not pay the price in blood? His fingers closed around it, and in that moment, the shadow of Númenor's downfall stretched long across his soul. The elves recoiled as Isildur rose, the ring clutched tight. Gil-galad's spear tip-dipped, his eyes dark with foresight. Destroy it, he urged, his voice raw with exhaustion and dread. Cast it into Orodruin's fire, lest it betray us all. But Isildur's gaze had turned inward, fixed on visions only he could see. Cities rebuilt, glory restored, a king's vengeance wrought in flame. No, he said at last, the word final as a tomb's ceiling. This is where a guild for my father's death, mine to wield as I choose. The campfires that night burned low, their light feeble against the creeping dark. Men celebrated their hard-won peace, but the elves kept vigil, their songs muted. High in the mountains, the dwarves sharpened their axes and spoke little. And Isildur, alone in his tent, turned the ring in his hands, watching the firelight dance across its surface. It showed him things, glimpses of a future where no enemy dared challenge him, where the name of Númenor was feared again. Never mind the way the gold seared his skin when he slipped it onto his finger. Never mind the whispers that slithered through his dreams. The war was over. The age of men had begun, but far to the east, in the ruins of Barad-dûr, a shadow stirred. The ring had a will of its own, and it remembered its master. The journey back to Gondor should have been triumphant, banners raised high, songs ringing through the valleys, but the air hung thick with unease. Isildur's fingers strayed off into the pouch at his belt, tracing the outline of the ring, as if to reassure himself it had not vanished like mist. By day, he wore the mantle of a king, dispensing justice from his tent, overseeing the distribution of spoils, his voice steady as he spoke of rebuilding. But in the flicker of torchlight, his counselors noted the way his gaze would drift westward, toward the sea road where Numenor had once been, as though the ring whispered reminders of all he'd lost and all it promised to restore. Elrond's warnings lingered like a thorn. The elf had not raised his voice in anger, nor had he pleaded. His words were simple, carved with the precision of a blade. This is no heirloom. It is a chain. Yet Isildur had seen the way even the wise recoiled from it, their eyes clouded with fear. Fear of what? Of a king's rightful claim. The ring pulsed warmly against his skin, its weight both comforting and curious. A thing so small, yet heavy with the gravity of empires. When he slid it onto his finger in the solitude of his tent, the world sharpened, colors deepening as if veils had been lifted. Distant voices became clear, the rustle of guards' armor outside as distinct as if they stood beside him. Power hummed in his veins, sweet and heady as summer wine, but the nights told a different tale. Dreams came like tides, relentless. In them, he stood again on the deck of his father's ship, the waves churning black beneath him as Numenor sank beneath the waves. Only this time, it was not the Valar's wrath that dragged the island under. It was his own hand, the golden glow of the ring staining the water as he reached for it. He would wake gasping, the sheets tangled around him, the pouch at his bedside seeming to pulse in time with his racing heart. Dawn brought no relief, only the gnawing sense of being watched. Even the Palantir, once a trusted counselor, now showed him fractured visions, his sons' faces warped with suspicion, his people's cheers fading into the hiss of distant flames. The court in Osgiliath noticed the change. Where once Isildur had moved among them with the ease of a man born to rule, he now paced the halls like a caged wolf, his temper fraying at the slightest provocation. Counselors who questioned the distribution of lands found themselves abruptly dismissed. Old allies, their loyalty forged in the fires of Mordor, exchanged wary glances when he praised the ring's craftsmanship a little too fervently. A tool, he called it, to ensure Gondor's safety. But tools do not whisper. Tools do not coil around the wielder's will like ivy strangling a tree. On the anniversary of Elendil's death, Isildur ordered a memorial carved into the white stone of the citadel, a likeness of his father, stern and noble, gazing eternally westward. The artisans worked day and night, yet when the veil was lifted, the crowd's murmurs were not of reverence, but confusion. The statue's eyes, meant to hold the wisdom of Numenor, were hollow, its mouth twisted in a grimace. Isildur stared at it for a long moment before turning away, his hand clutching the pouch. That night, he dreamt of the statue reaching for him, its stone fingers brushing the ring and crumbling to dust the moment they touched it. The road north to Arnor was meant to be a respite, a chance to settle disputes between his sons, to walk the lands his father had entrusted to him. But as his company crossed the Mythethel, a skirmish with bandits sent arrows slicing through the twilight. Isildur's guards fell into formation, shields locked, but something in the chaos, the scent of blood, the screams of horses unspooled a thread of rage in his chest. The ring was on his finger before he could think, its heat searing his skin as the world narrowed to a tunnel of gold. The bandits' cries cut off abruptly. When the light faded, the riverbank was littered with bodies, their faces frozen in terror. His men said nothing, but their silence was louder than accusation. Back in his tent, Isildur stared at the ring, now cool and innocent in his palm. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in. What had Elrond called it? A chain. He thought of his father's last words, "Remember the white tree," not a plea for vengeance, but a reminder of what they were meant to nurture. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the ordinary sweetness of a world that asked nothing of him but to rule it wisely. The ring glinted, its surface reflecting not his face, but a shadow. A king enthroned in fire, his kingdom a wasteland of ash. He slipped it back into its pouch, his hands trembling. The road home stretched long ahead, and every step would be a battle. The ring had chosen him, but choice, he was beginning to understand, was a blade that cut both ways. The road north had seemed safe, a well-traveled path flanked by the whispering reeds of the Anduin, the autumn sun dappling the forest floor. Isildur's company rode with the ease of men who'd survived the Black Gate, their laughter carrying on the wind. Yet the ring in its pouch weighed heavier with each mile, its presence a dull throb against Isildur's hip, as if it resented being carried farther from the fires that had forged it. He told himself it was mere fatigue, the weariness of a king returning to his lands after years of war, but the dreams had grown sharper, visions of the river rising to claim him, its currents weaving through his fingers like liquid gold. The attack came at dusk, when the mist curled thick over the Gladden fields. One moment, the scouts were calling back to the column. The next, the air was alive with the snarl of orcs, their crude arrows cutting through the twilight. Isildur's guard closed ranks, their shields a wall of steel, but the enemy surged from the marshes like rats from a sinking ship. In the chaos, the ring's whisper became a scream. "Put me on," it hissed, "and none shall touch you." His fingers trembled as he drew it from the pouch, not in fear, but in fury. These were no mere bandits. This was a hunt. The moment the gold slid onto his finger, the world shattered into brilliance and terror. The orcs' guttural cries twisted into clarity, their movements slow as flies in amber. He cut through them like a scythe through wheat, his broken sword flashing with a light it had not held since his father's hands wielded it. But the ring's gift was a lie. With each step, the river's murmur grew louder, the current tugging at his boots as if the water itself sought to claim him. Then came the arrow, a lucky shot from the shadows, piercing his shoulder. The pain jolted the ring from his grasp, and with it went the veil of power. The orcs saw him then, truly saw him, a king brought low by his own defiance. Isildur stumbled backward, the cold rush of the Anduin swallowing his cry. The last thing he saw was the ring, glinting like a serpent's eye on the surface of the water, before the darkness took him. His body would never be found, though the river would whisper of it for ages, a king who carried the weight of a drowned kingdom to his grave. News of his death spread like a bruise across the free peoples. In Rivendell, Elrond bowed his head, not in surprise, but in sorrowful recognition. The elves had long known the price of such treasures. In Gondor, Isildur's sons clutched their father's empty cloak, their grief laced with a dawning dread. The war they thought won had only just begun. And in the depths of the Anduin, the ring settled into the silt, patient as a coiled viper. The currents could not move it, time could not erode it. It waited, as all things of shadow wait, for hands foolish enough to reach, for hearts hungry enough to listen. The free peoples mourned, raising cairns of stone in Gladden's memory, unaware that the true menace had not perished, but merely slept. Numenor's pride had drowned beneath the waves. Isildur's ambition had sunk beneath the river, and the ring, that golden whisper of ruin, bided its time, for shadows, after all, need no breath to endure. The white tree of Minas Tirith stands silent in the courtyard, its blossoms trembling in the wind like the last breath of a forgotten age. Every spring, when its petals unfurl against the stone walls of the citadel, the stewards of Gondor pause, just for a moment, to trace the veins of its leaves, as if touching the skin of a ghost. This is no ordinary tree. Its roots stretch back through time, back to the orchards of Armanelos, where Nimloth, the fair, once bloomed in the shadow of Númenor's golden towers. The gardeners tend it with hands that shake, not from labor, but from the weight of what it represents, a kingdom drowned, a promise unbroken. Generations have come and gone since Elendil's ships scraped onto Middle-earth shores, yet the past refuses to sink quietly into legend. In Gondor's libraries, scribes still copy maps of an island none have seen, their ink staining parchment with coastlines that vanished beneath the waves. The old songs, once banned in Númenor's final days, are sung softly in the taverns of Pelargir, where sailors claim to hear whispers in the crash of the surf, voices calling in a tongue no living man understands. Even the architecture betrays the longing. Every tower in Minas Tirith is built to face westward, its windows framing the sunset like prisoners staring at a locked door. The sea longing is more than memory. It's a sickness in the blood. Children born leagues from any shore wake gasping from dreams of tides they've never witnessed. Commanders leading patrols along Mordor's ashen borders find themselves distracted by the flight of gulls, their thoughts dragged inexplicably toward the horizon. Some call it a curse, the Valar's reminder of the price of defiance. Others insist it's a gift, the last thread tethering Gondor to the greatness it once knew. Either way, it cannot be ignored. When Denethor, the last ruling steward before the War of the Ring, paced the halls of the White Tower in his madness, it was not the enemy's armies he raved about, but the sound of waves in his skull. And yet, for all its grief, the legacy of Numenor is not one of despair. The same blood that remembers drowning also remembers how to build, how to endure. The stones of Osgiliath may crumble, the throne of Minas Tirith may sit empty for centuries, but the white tree endures, stunted one age, flourishing the next, as if testing the wind for a scent it cannot name. Aragorn, when he comes at last to claim his kingship, does not plant a new sapling. He reveals one, hidden in the shadows of the mountains, its lineage unbroken. The message is clear. Gondor's roots are deeper than the ruin of its ancestors. The people know this, even if they cannot articulate it. When Faramir speaks of the downfall of Númenor to Frodo in the hidden halls of Henneth Annûn, his voice is heavy not with bitterness, but with a strange reverence. The tale is not just a warning, it's a compass. Every decision Gondor makes, to resist Sauron, to preserve lore, to choose stewardship over dominion, echoes the choices that doomed their forebears. The difference is in the correction. Where Ar-Pharazôn reached for immortality, Aragorn accepts mortality with grace. Where Sauron's whispers bred arrogance, Gandalf's counsel nurtures humility. And so the tree blooms, season after season, a silent witness to the paradox of inheritance. The past is a weight, yes, but also a foundation. The sea may call, but Gondor's feet remain firmly planted on the earth. The blood of Numenor is both wound and wisdom, and its children, though they bear the scars, have learned at last to stop fighting the tide. Instead, they build ships not for conquest, but for homecoming. Not to challenge the gods, but to finally make peace with them. The waves still murmur of Numenor's glory and folly, a lesson etched into the bones of the earth. Even now, when the wind sweeps across the shores of Middle-earth, it carries echoes of a kingdom that reached too high, a people who dared to grasp at eternity and found only the depths. The sea, once their ally, became their tomb, and the Valar's judgment left no marker, no monument, only the endless roll of the tides. Yet the story did not end there. It never truly ends. Like the roots of the white tree, hidden but unbroken, the legacy of Numenor twists through time, shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. The faithful's descendants keep their vigil, their eyes turned westward, not in longing for what was lost, but in remembrance of what must never be forgotten. In Gondor's halls, the line of kings traces back to Elendil the Tall, his name spoken with reverence, his choices studied like scripture. Every decision they make, whether to rebuild Osgiliath's bridges or resist the lure of power, is weighed against the shadow of their ancestors' pride. The past is not a chain, but a compass. When Aragorn kneels before the white tree, his hands stained with soil rather than gold, he embodies the lesson Numenor learned too late, that true strength lies not in defiance of the divine, but in harmony with it. And what of Sauron? The shadow that orchestrated Numenor's fall thought itself victorious, yet its triumph was hollow. The ring, that golden whisper of corruption, slipped from Isildur's grasp as surely as the island sank beneath the waves. The Dark Lord's malice outlived his body, but so did the light of the faithful. For every orc that marches from Mordor, there's a ranger in the north who remembers the old ways. For every lie that seeps into the hearts of men, there's a scribe in Gondor's archives, copying the chronicles of Armenilos, ensuring the warnings endure. The gathering dark may loom, but it is not unopposed. In the quiet corners of Middle-earth, in the hobbit holes of the Shire, the dwarven halls of Erebor, the elven refuges of Rivendell, the flame of Numenor's wisdom flickers on. It burns in Bilbo's songs of Erendil, in Galadriel's refusal of the ring, in Samwise Gamgee's steadfast loyalty. These are not grand gestures, not the stuff of epic ballads, but they are the threads that weave the tapestry of resistance. The shadow believes it has already won. It does not understand that the light it seeks to extinguish was never held in towers or crowns, but in the simple, stubborn act of remembering. So let the waves murmur, let the wind carry the salt of a drowned kingdom to the shores of those who still listen. The lesson of Numenor is not one of despair, but of resilience, a reminder that even the mightiest waves cannot wash away what is written in the heart. The sun sets on the ruins of a dream, but it rises, always, on those who carry its light forward.